The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, sending golden liquid splashing across Richard Blackwood's Italian leather shoes. The billionaire stood frozen in the doorway of his own ballroom, watching as the woman he'd invited as entertainment, his own cleaning lady, commanded the attention of every Fortune 500 CEO, senator, and socialite in the room. Victoria Sterling wasn't scrubbing floors tonight. She stood at the center of his charity gala in a midnight blue gown that cost more than most people's cars, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers as she laughed at something the governor had just whispered in her ear. This was supposed to be Richard's night of ultimate humiliation for her. Instead, she'd turned his mansion into her stage, and everyone, including his own wife, was mesmerized. If you're drawn into stories where karma strikes with precision and the underdog rises like a phoenix, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button and join the Acts of Depth family, because what happens next will remind you why the universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales. 3 weeks earlier, Victoria Sterling had been on her knees in that same ballroom, scrubbing a wine stain from the imported Persian rug while Richard Blackwood conducted a conference call on speaker, deliberately loud enough for her to hear every word about his latest acquisition, a tech company he'd bought for $3 billion. She'd worked for the Blackwood family for 2 years, arriving every Tuesday and Friday at dawn to clean their 30-room mansion overlooking the Pacific. Richard had never once looked her in the eye, preferring to leave notes about missed spots or inadequate shine on the silverware. His wife Eleanor was kinder but distant, offering polite smiles that never reached her eyes. Their teenage daughter Madison treated Victoria like furniture, something to navigate around while texting on her phone. Victoria had taken the job out of necessity, not choice. At 52, with her graying hair always pulled back in a practical bun and her uniform of black slacks and white polo shirt, she moved through the mansion like a shadow. The other staff members, the gardeners, the pool maintenance crew, the occasional caterers, all knew her as Quiet Victoria, the woman who hummed gospel songs while she worked and always had a thermos of sweet tea in her car. What none of them knew was that she drove past 3 other mansions on her way to work each morning, mansions where she could have been the one hosting galas instead of cleaning up after them. The invitation had been Richard's idea of a cruel joke. He'd left it on the kitchen counter one Friday morning, right next to a note complaining about water spots on the wine glasses. The gold-embossed card invited her to the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala, the social event of the season where tickets started at $10,000 per plate. At the bottom, in Richard's own handwriting, he'd added, "Why don't you come, Victoria? It would be amusing to have you serve drinks to my guests in something other than that dreadful uniform. Consider it a bonus opportunity to earn some real money for once." Victoria had stood in that kitchen for a full minute, holding the invitation while rage coursed through her veins like electricity. She thought about the past 2 years of disrespect, the deliberately spilled coffee she'd had to clean while Richard smirked, the times he'd accidentally tracked mud through the house right after she'd finished mopping. She thought about the morning she'd overheard him on the phone, laughing about the help and how they should be grateful for any work at all in this economy. Most of all, she thought about the safe in his study, the one she cleaned around every week, and the documents she'd glimpsed one day when he'd carelessly left it open, documents that would make this charity gala very interesting indeed. That evening, Victoria had driven not to her modest apartment in the valley, but to a storage unit in Beverly Hills. She punched in the code and rolled up the metal door to reveal a space that looked like a high-end boutique. Designer gowns hung in climate-controlled garment bags. Boxes of Italian shoes lined custom shelves. In a velvet-lined case sat jewelry that would make even Eleanor Blackwood envious. Victoria ran her fingers along a particular gown, midnight blue silk that moved like water, remembering the last time she'd worn it to a gala, her own gala, in her own mansion, before everything had been stolen from her. The Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala was Richard's crown jewel, his annual opportunity to parade his wealth and connections before the media. This year's theme was, giving back to those less fortunate, an irony not lost on Victoria as she'd scrubbed his bathroom that morning, listening to him practice his speech about compassion and generosity. The mansion had been transformed with hundreds of thousands of dollars in decorations, crystal installations, living walls of white roses, ice sculptures shaped like swans. The guest list read like a Forbes power ranking: tech moguls, Hollywood executives, political figures, and old money dynasties. Richard stood at the entrance in his custom tuxedo, greeting guests with his practiced smile and firm handshake. Eleanor floated beside him in a silver gown, her face a mask of elegant boredom. Madison had been forced to attend despite her protests, sulking in a corner while live-streaming the event to her followers with sarcastic commentary. The ballroom filled with the kind of people who measured their worth in stock portfolios and private jets, each conversation a careful dance of networking and subtle one-upmanship. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Richard clinked his champagne glass, calling attention for his speech. He stood at the microphone, his voice carrying across the room as he spoke about the importance of lifting up those less fortunate, of using privilege for purpose. The irony was so thick Victoria could have cut it with one of the silver cake knives she'd polished that morning. He was just reaching the crescendo of his speech, the part where he would announce this year's charitable initiative, when the ballroom doors opened. The entire room turned as one toward the entrance. Victoria Sterling stood framed in the doorway, but this wasn't the Victoria they knew. Gone was the practical bun, her hair cascaded in elegant waves past her shoulders, streaked with subtle highlights that caught the light. The midnight blue gown hugged her figure before flowing into a train that pooled like liquid silk. The diamond necklace at her throat wasn't costume jewelry from a department store. It was the real thing, a piece that several women in the room recognized from a Sotheby's auction catalog 3 years prior. It had sold for $2.3 million. Richard's speech died mid-sentence. The microphone picked up his sharp intake of breath, broadcasting his shock through the speaker system. Eleanor's champagne glass tilted dangerously, saved only by a waiter's quick reflexes. Madison actually looked up from her phone, her mouth falling open as she recognized the woman who'd cleaned her bathroom that very morning. But it was the reaction of the other guests that transformed the moment from surprising to seismic. Victoria. The voice belonged to James Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies, one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley. He crossed the room in quick strides, his face lighting up with genuine delight. Victoria Sterling. My God, it's been years. I thought you'd moved to Europe. The name rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Victoria Sterling. Not Victoria the cleaning lady. Victoria Sterling, who'd once run one of the most successful investment firms on the West Coast. Victoria Sterling, whose husband's death in a plane crash 5 years ago had been front-page news. Victoria Sterling, who disappeared from public life after her brother-in-law had orchestrated a hostile takeover of her company while she was still in mourning. James, Victoria said warmly, accepting his kiss on both cheeks. How wonderful to see you. And is that Patricia? She waved to James's wife, who was already making her way over, her face bright with excitement. Within moments, Victoria was surrounded by people who remembered her from her previous life, people who'd wondered where she'd gone, people who were delighted to see her return. Richard stood frozen at the microphone, watching his carefully orchestrated evening slip from his control. He'd invited Victoria to humiliate her, to parade his power over someone he saw as beneath him. Instead, she was holding court in his ballroom, and some of his most important guests were treating her like visiting royalty. Even worse, Eleanor had descended from the stage and was moving through the crowd toward Victoria, her face a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria's voice carried across the room without the need for a microphone. She'd learned long ago how to command attention. Please, don't let me interrupt Richard's wonderful speech about helping the less fortunate. I'm particularly interested in hearing about the Blackwood Foundation's financial transparency. Richard, you were just about to share how much of the donated funds actually reached the intended recipients, weren't you? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. It was an open secret in their circles that charity foundations were often tax shelters and networking opportunities rather than genuine philanthropic endeavors, but nobody talked about it so directly. Richard's face flushed red, then white, as he struggled to respond. I don't believe we've met properly, Eleanor said, reaching Victoria's circle. Her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp with intelligence. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood." "Victoria Sterling," Victoria replied, taking Eleanor's offered hand. "Though I believe we have met, Mrs. Blackwood. Every Tuesday and Friday for the past 2 years. I particularly remember the morning you were crying in the conservatory over photographs. You thought you were alone." Eleanor's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing raw vulnerability before she rebuilt her composure. "You're the woman who hums gospel songs," she said quietly. "The one who always leaves fresh flowers in my reading nook, even though it's not part of your duties." "Everyone deserves small kindnesses," Victoria replied. "Especially those living in gilded cages." The exchange was quiet, but Madison had crept closer with her phone, live-streaming the entire interaction. The teenager's followers were going wild in the comments, trying to piece together what was happening. The cleaning lady was actually some rich lady. Why was she cleaning houses? What did she mean about gilded cages? The drama was better than any reality show. Richard finally found his voice, stepping down from the stage with forced casualness. "Victoria, what an unexpected pleasure. I had no idea you'd actually attend. Though I'm curious how you managed the $10,000 entry donation on a housekeeper's salary." "Oh, Richard," Victoria laughed, and it wasn't a bitter laugh but genuinely amused. "Did you really think I needed your invitation? I've been a platinum donor to the Blackwood Foundation for 3 years. Though I've been donating under my maiden name, Sterling. I wanted to see where my money was going. Imagine my surprise when I discovered I was funding the same champagne I was cleaning up and the same floral arrangements I was dusting." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people pulled out their phones, quickly searching for donor lists. Richard's jaw tightened as he realized the implications. Victoria had been investigating his foundation from the inside, watching him, studying his operations while he treated her like invisible help. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Sterling donations come from an offshore trust. We've never met the donor." "Never met her face to face," Victoria corrected. "But you've sent me plenty of correspondence. Thank you notes, gala invitations, requests for additional funding. I particularly enjoyed the letter where you promised that every dollar would go directly to helping underprivileged families. Tell me, Richard, does your new yacht count as helping the underprivileged? Or perhaps the property in Aspen that the foundation purchased for administrative retreats?" The ballroom had become a theater, and every guest was now an audience member to an unfolding drama they couldn't have paid to see. Security guards near the exits looked uncertain, glancing between Richard and Victoria, unsure whether they were supposed to intervene. The catering staff had stopped circulating, frozen with their silver trays as they watched their employer squirm under the steady gaze of a woman they'd seen taking out trash bags just hours earlier. "You're making serious accusations," Richard said, attempting to regain control. His voice carried the threat that had intimidated countless business opponents. Slander and defamation carry serious legal consequences, especially when made in front of witnesses. Documentation carries even more serious consequences, Victoria replied smoothly. She reached into her elegant clutch and pulled out her phone. Especially when that documentation includes photographs of foundation records that show systematic embezzlement. Records that were carelessly left open in a certain safe while someone was day drinking during what he thought was a private conference call. Richard's face drained of all color. He remembered that day 3 months ago, the merger celebration, the bottle of 30-year-old scotch, the safe he'd forgotten to close before passing out on his office couch. He'd woken to find Victoria quietly cleaning around him, never imagining she'd noticed anything amiss. "You had no right," he snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. "That's breaking and entering, theft of private property." Actually, a new voice interrupted, photographing evidence of financial crimes could be considered whistleblowing, protected under federal law. The speaker was Daniel Morrison, senior partner at Morrison, Klein & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. He moved to stand beside Victoria, his presence a clear declaration of sides. I'd be happy to represent Ms. Sterling if you'd like to pursue that avenue, Richard. The offer wasn't just professional courtesy. Daniel Morrison didn't take cases unless he knew he could win, and he didn't offer representation in front of witnesses unless he'd already seen enough evidence to guarantee victory. His presence beside Victoria was a message every person in that room could read. She had proof, and it was damning. Eleanor stepped forward, her movement drawing all eyes. For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting to see if she would stand by her husband or turn against him. She looked between Richard and Victoria, her face unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice carrying a quiet strength that surprised everyone, including her husband. The photographs in the conservatory, Eleanor said slowly, they were from a private investigator. I hired him 6 months ago when I discovered discrepancies in our personal accounts. Money moving to places it shouldn't go, transactions that didn't match Richard's explanations. She turned to face her husband fully. I've known about the affairs, Richard. All of them. But I stayed for Madison, for the facade of family. What I didn't know was that you were stealing from a charity meant to help children. Madison lowered her phone, staring at her mother as if seeing her for the first time. The teenager had stopped live streaming, but hundreds of thousands of viewers were still watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The family drama playing out in real time was beyond anything they could have imagined. Eleanor, Richard started, reaching for his wife's arm, but she stepped back, moving instead to stand beside Victoria. Every Tuesday and Friday, Eleanor said to the room at large, this woman came into my home. She saw me at my lowest moments, saw the bruises I covered with makeup, heard the arguments I tried to hide. And never once did she judge me. She left flowers in my reading nook. She hummed songs that reminded me there was still beauty in the world. She showed me more genuine kindness than anyone in my social circle ever has. Victoria reached out and took Eleanor's hand, squeezing it gently. The gesture was simple, human, and it broke something in Eleanor that had been holding rigid for years. Tears ran down her face, ruining her perfect makeup, and she didn't care. The foundation records aren't the only thing I have, Victoria said, her voice gentle but firm. I have recordings, Richard. Every cruel comment you made while I cleaned, every phone call where you discussed hiding assets, every conversation about destroying competitors through illegal means. You never noticed me, never thought the help might be listening, might be understanding every word. The room erupted. Guests pulled out phones, calling lawyers, advisors, publicists. Several headed for the exits, not wanting to be associated with what was clearly about to become a massive scandal. Others pressed closer, drawn by the irresistible pull of witnessing a powerful man's downfall. Richard's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. He could see it in the faces of his business partners, already calculating how to distance themselves from him. He could see it in the way his security team had subtly shifted their positions, no longer protecting him but containing him. Most of all, he could see it in Madison's eyes, the disgust, the disappointment, the loss of any remaining respect for her father. You set me up, Richard said, his voice hollow. This whole thing, working for me, tonight, it was all a setup. Victoria shook her head. I took the job because I needed to work while my lawyers fought to recover what was stolen from me. I cleaned your house because it was honest work, and I've never been ashamed of honest work. But then I saw who you really were, Richard. I saw how you treated people you considered beneath you. I saw the charity fraud, the hidden accounts, the destroyed lives. And yes, then I decided to document everything. She turned to address the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd once commanded boardrooms and million-dollar deals. The Blackwood Foundation has raised $43 million over the past 5 years. Less than 8% has reached any charitable cause. The rest has been funneled through shell companies into private accounts. I have the documentation, and I've already provided it to the FBI and the IRS. They'll be here within the hour. The revelation landed like a bomb. Several guests immediately headed for the exits, their lawyers already on speed dial. Others stood frozen, calculating their own exposure. How many of them had claimed tax deductions for donations that had funded Richard's lifestyle instead of helping children? The social elite who'd gathered to celebrate their own generosity were suddenly facing the possibility of being implicated in a federal investigation. Richard lunged forward, his composure finally shattering completely. "You vindictive witch. You think you can destroy me? I have connections you can't imagine. I'll bury you in legal fees. I'll make sure you never." His threat was cut short by the arrival of something he hadn't expected. Madison stepped between her father and Victoria, her phone held high, still recording. "Touch her and this goes viral instantly," the teenager said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 400,000 people are watching right now, Dad. They've seen everything. They've heard everything." Richard froze, looking at his daughter as if seeing a stranger. Madison had always been his princess, spoiled and sheltered, more interested in social media than social justice. But standing there, protecting the woman who'd cleaned their toilets, she looked like her mother, the Eleanor he'd married 20 years ago, before money and power had poisoned everything. "You want to know what Victoria Sterling was doing cleaning our house?" Madison said, turning to face the crowd while keeping her phone trained on her father. "She was showing more class and dignity than anyone else in this room. She was teaching me through example what actual strength looks like. Every week, I watched her work with grace while my father tried to humiliate her. I watched her leave quarters in my jewelry box when she thought I'd lost my allowance. I watched her care for my mother when everyone else just enabled the misery." The teenager's confession was raw, unrehearsed, and it resonated with the humanity that had been missing from the Gilded Evening. Online, her followers were sharing the stream across every platform, and the view count climbed past 1 million. The hashtag Victoria Standing began trending within minutes. "There's something else," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the chaos. She reached into her clutch again and pulled out a single key. "This opens a safety deposit box at First National. Inside is a USB drive containing something that belongs to you, Eleanor." She handed the key to Richard's wife. "Your grandmother's inheritance. The $20 million Richard told you was lost in bad investments. It wasn't lost. He moved it offshore, planning to use it for his exit strategy when everything eventually caught up with him." Eleanor took the key with trembling fingers. $20 million. Her grandmother's fortune, left specifically to her, not to the marital assets. Money that would mean freedom, independence, the ability to leave without being destroyed financially. She looked at Victoria with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "How did you find it?" Eleanor whispered. "The same way I found everything else," Victoria replied. "By being invisible. By being in rooms where powerful men felt safe to reveal their true selves. By understanding that the person who cleans up your messes often knows your secrets better than you do." The sound of sirens began to filter through the ballroom windows. Multiple vehicles, from the sound of it. Richard's head snapped toward the entrance, his fight-or-flight instinct finally kicking in. But there was nowhere to run. His own security team had shifted their allegiance, subtly blocking any exit route. They knew which way the wind was blowing, and it wasn't in Richard Blackwood's favor. "You should know," Victoria said, addressing Richard directly now, "that I've also sent evidence to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the SEC. By morning, the Blackwood empire will be front-page news. Your investors will pull out. Your board will call an emergency meeting. Your assets will be frozen. Everything you built on the backs of others will crumble." "Why?" Richard's voice broke on the word. "If you had all this evidence, why wait? Why work for me for 2 years? Why subject yourself to my treatment?" Victoria's expression softened, not with pity but with something like understanding. "Because I needed to be sure. I needed to know that you weren't just a man who'd made mistakes but one who would continue hurting people without consequence. Every week, you had the opportunity to show basic human decency. Every week, you chose cruelty instead. You made your choice, Richard. Over and over again. The FBI agents entered the ballroom with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested they'd been briefed thoroughly. The lead agent, a woman in a crisp black suit, walked directly to Richard. Mr. Blackwood, I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents cuffed Richard, the room remained frozen in a tableau of shock and fascination. The mighty Richard Blackwood, who'd started the evening at the pinnacle of his power, was being led away in handcuffs while the woman he tried to humiliate stood like a queen in his own ballroom. But Victoria wasn't finished. She turned to address the room one final time, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it for every person who's been stepped on by someone who thought power meant the right to be cruel. I did it for every worker treated as less than human by people who've forgotten their own humanity. She paused, looking at the faces around her, some ashamed, some inspired, some still processing what they'd witnessed. I was Victoria Sterling, investment mogul. Then I was Victoria, the cleaning lady. Tonight, I'm simply Victoria, a woman who understands that true power isn't about how many people you can crush. It's about how many people you can lift up. The ballroom began to empty as guests processed what they'd witnessed, but Victoria remained, standing in the center of the space she'd cleaned so many times. Eleanor stood beside her, still clutching the key to her grandmother's fortune, while Madison live-streamed the aftermath to an audience that had grown to 2 million viewers. The FBI agents had taken Richard away, but the echoes of his downfall reverberated through the marble halls. What will you do now? Eleanor asked Victoria, her voice small in the vast space. You've got your justice. You've exposed him. Where do you go from here? Victoria smiled, and for the first time that evening, it reached her eyes fully. First, I'm going to finish what I started with my company. My brother-in-law may have stolen it, but like Richard, he wasn't as clever as he thought. The same investigation that uncovered Richard's crimes also revealed the fraud in my own family's betrayal. My lawyers tell me I'll have my firm back within 6 months. And the cleaning? Madison asked, lowering her phone for the first time. Will you stop? Actually, Victoria said thoughtfully, I'm thinking of starting a different kind of cleaning company. One that employs women escaping difficult situations, pays them living wages, and treats them with dignity. I've learned a lot these past 2 years about the value of honest work and the people who do it. James Chen, who had lingered to witness the conclusion of the evening's drama, stepped forward. I'd invest in that, he said simply. Consider it seed funding. 20 million to start. Others began stepping forward, inspired by the moment or perhaps seeking to cleanse their own consciences. Patricia Chen offered connections to women's shelters. Daniel Morrison volunteered legal services. Even some of Richard's former associates, eager to distance themselves from his toxicity, pledged support. Within minutes, Victoria had commitments totaling $50 million for a business that hadn't existed an hour ago. Eleanor turned to her daughter, seeing Madison in a new light. The teenager had shown courage tonight, standing up to her father, protecting Victoria, broadcasting truth to the world. I'm proud of you, Eleanor said softly. Your grandmother would have been too. Mom, Madison said, her voice cracking, what are we going to do? Dad's going to prison. The house will be seized. Everyone at school will know. Everything's going to change. Everything needs to change, Eleanor replied, pulling her daughter close. We've been living in a beautifully decorated prison, baby. Maybe it's time we learned what freedom feels like. Victoria watched the mother and daughter embrace, remembering her own losses, her own journey from the heights of success to the depths of despair and back again. She thought about the morning she'd arrived at the mansion in darkness, her back aching from the previous day's work, her hands rough from cleaning chemicals. She thought about the humiliation she'd endured, the tests of her patience and dignity, the moments when she'd wanted to reveal herself but knew the timing wasn't right. There's one more thing, Victoria said, reaching into her clutch for the last time. She pulled out a check, already filled out, and handed it to Eleanor. This is for you and Madison. It's not charity, and it's not pity. It's an investment in your future, whatever you decide that looks like. Eleanor looked at the check, $5 million, enough to start over anywhere, to build a new life free from Richard's shadow. I can't accept this, she said, even as her fingers tightened on the paper. You already have, Victoria said gently. The moment you stood up to him tonight, you accepted that you deserved better. This is just making that possible. The sirens had faded, but the impact of the evening would ripple for months, even years. The Blackwood Foundation scandal would trigger investigations into dozens of similar charities. Richard would face 20 years in federal prison. His assets would be liquidated, his empire dismantled piece by piece. The mansion would be sold to a tech entrepreneur who would turn it into a center for underprivileged youth, an irony that would have made Victoria smile if she'd known. As the last guests departed and the catering staff began the familiar ritual of cleanup, Victoria walked through the ballroom one final time. She paused at the spot where she'd spent hours on her knees, scrubbing wine stains from Persian rugs. She looked at the windows she'd polished until they were invisible, the crystals she'd cleaned one by one on the massive chandeliers. Miss Sterling. One of the catering staff, a young woman named Rosa whom Victoria had worked alongside many times, approached hesitantly. We heard everything. What you did tonight, thank you. For all of us who are invisible, thank you. Victoria embraced Rosa, feeling the circle complete itself. We're not invisible, she said firmly. We never were. They just chose not to see us. But that blindness was their weakness, not ours. Madison posted her final video of the night, a simple shot of Victoria walking out of the Blackwood mansion with her head held high, the train of her midnight blue gown trailing behind her like water under moonlight. The caption read, "This is what dignity looks like. This is what justice looks like. This is what rising above looks like. #Victoria Standing." Within hours, the video had 50 million views. Messages poured in from workers around the world, janitors, housekeepers, retail employees, everyone who'd ever been treated as less than human by someone with power. Victoria Sterling had become more than a symbol of justice, she'd become proof that dignity couldn't be destroyed by those who tried to humiliate the humble. 3 years later, Sterling Dignity Services employed 12,000 people across the country, all earning above living wages with full benefits. The company's motto, displayed in every office, read, "Honest work, honest wages, honest respect." Eleanor Blackwood, who had returned to her maiden name, Eleanor Mitchell, served on the board of directors, using her experience to help other women escape toxic situations. Madison was in her second year at Columbia, studying journalism with a focus on social justice, her father's downfall having transformed her from influencer to activist. And Victoria? She still arrived at work early, though now it was to a corner office overlooking the city instead of a supply closet in someone else's mansion. But she kept one thing from her cleaning days, a simple gold bracelet Richard had once knocked off a table, dismissing it as worthless costume jewelry. She'd recognized it as Eleanor's grandmother's, a family heirloom that meant everything to a lonely woman in a loveless marriage. She'd saved it, polished it, and returned it that night at the gala. Eleanor had wept when she realized Victoria had been protecting her treasures all along, even while being treated as less than human. The bracelet now sat in a frame on Victoria's desk, a reminder that kindness is never wasted, that dignity cannot be taken unless it's surrendered, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up as yourself, even if that means showing up as a cleaning lady who's actually a queen. The story of Victoria Sterling became legend in certain circles, proof that karma might move slowly, but when it arrives dressed in midnight blue and carrying evidence. Some nights, when Victoria worked late in her office, she could still hear the echo of Richard's voice from that evening, "You set me up." And she would smile, knowing he still didn't understand. She hadn't set him up. She'd simply held up a mirror and let him see himself clearly for the first time. The horror on his face hadn't been about losing his fortune or his freedom, it had been the recognition of what he'd become when he thought no one important was watching. But someone was always watching. Someone was always listening. And sometimes, that someone was cleaning your bathroom, humming gospel songs, and taking notes that would one day bring your empire crashing down around your Italian leather shoes. Justice, Victoria had learned, sometimes wore a uniform and carried a mop. And when it finally revealed itself, it did so with perfect timing, undeniable evidence, and a dignity that no amount of money could buy or destroy. The Acts of Depth family knows that every story of redemption begins with someone who refuses to let their spirit be broken. If Victoria's journey reminded you that your current struggle might be preparing you for your greatest triumph, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and remember, you might be cleaning someone's floor today, but that doesn't mean you won't own the building tomorrow. Your dignity is your superpower, and your time is coming.